Hey friends, welcome to another episode of the God Questions podcast. I'm Rachel Short and this is Mark Lucinius.
Hi there.
And we are part of a church planting team in the Westchester area who planted a church called Project 938 just about a year and a half ago. And we are in the midst of a series right now that we're calling the God Questions. And we're talking about each of the questions that many of us have about faith. We're talking about why bad things happen to good people. We're talking about the nature of the Old Testament versus the New Testament. We're talking about, is the Bible reliable? Can we place all of our hope in it? And this past Sunday, Mark, you talked about suffering. Would you like to talk? So Sunday mornings we're talking about the God Questions as well as this podcast, and you talked about suffering on Sunday. You want to talk a little bit about that?
Sure. The question is, why would a good God allow suffering? And first thing we talked about is how that's really a Christian question, because outside of the Christian faith, you wouldn't ask why a good God would allow suffering, because outside the Christian faith, there's no God. And so the alternative question is why does any good things happen in the world at all? That would be the challenge to somebody if I was talking to somebody outside the faith. But for those who are in the faith, we talked about two specific things, that regardless of the suffering and regardless of the pain, there's always a purpose in the pain, and God's presence is always with us in the pain. So you can check that out if you want to learn more about that.
Awesome. And last week's podcast, we started getting into the Old Testament versus the New Testament. And you had kind of ended talking a little bit about just the differences between the Old Testament and New Testament and the laws. What is with all of the laws of the Old Testament?
Sure, yeah. The character of it seems very, very, very different, right? Because there is a lot of laws, nationalistic kind of laws in the Old Testament that just don't exist in the New Testament. In fact, what do you see Jesus doing an awful lot? So can I summarize all this into one or two things, like love God and love your neighbor? And you see God. You see the New Testament, you see Jesus and the apostles simplifying the law. You see in the Old Testament this continuing growth of the many, many rules and regulations. And so that's it. It's not an uncommon question, and in fact, it's a really good question. What I want to do is I want to just kind of go back to just a little bit of church history and how the reformers thought of this. They said there are three purposes for the law, and understanding this, I think, is quite helpful. First one is this: that the law that you get in the Old Testament is a vision for life. And so God's intention for the world is that we would experience shalom, sort of an all-over harmony and goodness and rightness, sort of a fully just world, a fully good world, and a fully loving world. And so what you have in the Old Testament is God forming a people to follow and live out a life of shalom. And there were a lot of specifics around it. And part of it is that the culture they were living in was really far from anything like shalom. They were in a very polytheistic environment that didn't really have the values that we would even have in post-Christendom. It was a violent time, and so things like do not murder were important things to explain.
Yeah.
Adultery was an important thing to explain. One wife was an important thing to explain.
Right.
One God was important. In fact, it took almost 1,000 years to get through that really Yahweh was the only God. But it's hard for us to understand in that polytheistic environment. When I think of this, the way that the rules were trying to give a vision for life for folks in those ancient times, I think of what most parents are trying to do with their kids. Kids have rules as well, and sometimes you go to some homes and they got the rules on the wall with a list of all the bad things that are going to happen to them if they break those rules. My wife and I were just a little more simple. We had 3. All right. So show respect, be kind, and Well, I'm sure the other one.
The other one was very important,
anyway. So,
I'm sure.
but the idea of the basic rules of our family life wasn't so. We have a bedtime for our kids, not so that they will live a life of early bedtimes. I'm not going to check on my 23-year-old daughter to say, "Did you go to bed at 10 o'clock?" No, the idea is that we want her to value rest so she can value life. I'm not a particularly kind person when I'm not, when I've lost sleep, and so I teach my kids to value sleep so that they can live out a life of kindness and respect. And so towards others, the idea of the rules is to create a culture within our family life that they can begin move on and to live a life of love. So the first purpose of law is a vision for life. A vision for life. Were you going to say something?
Yeah. I was just going to ask you. So what would you say to someone who is exploring Christianity and they're coming in knowing a little bit maybe about the Ten Commandments, and so their idea of Christianity is perhaps more focused on the Old Testament. So I want to come in and I want to show respect. I want to do the Ten Commandments. How would you encourage them to think about the faith and think about exploring faith when it comes to looking at the Old Testament and the New Testament, if that makes sense?
Well, funny you should ask, because I've got two more purposes.
Good. Okay,
good. As you think about like the Ten Commandments are still legit.
Right.
They're still valid.
Right.
They are a way of living out life. The second purpose of the law and some of the laws of the Old Testament is that they would restrain sin. Just like don't hit your brother is restraining sin. Because if I can get her to not hit him, hopefully he won't hit her, and this thing won't end up in the ER. And if we can, and society has all sorts of rules like this, whether it's my homeowners association that won't let me own a goat, or it's or it's a speeding limit in our neighborhood that protects the children. All these things are to protect things, restrain sin, and those are helpful, but they also sort of have limitations, because the vision for life that God has isn't that you would just simply like do a bunch of rule things.
Right.
That's not the vision I have for my kids, that they would obey rules.
Yeah.
My vision for my kids that they would live lives of love and significance. And so the third purpose of law is that it exposes our need for salvation, because every single one of us throw off the rules in some way. I have this joke that I used to go to my kids' elementary school, and this elementary school, they had a tremendous principal. I mean, she had the laws, she had the rules, and she laid down those rules, and she kept those rules. And my kids had a great experience. But every time I would listen to her, I'd lean over to my wife and say, if I worked for her, she'd fire me. I would totally get myself fired, because I just know I couldn't obey her rules. I just could not live in there.
Right.
And that's why some people are made to be elementary school teachers, and I'm not one of them. But what it exposes is like, hey, look, every single rule exposes sort of like our need, and ultimately within the Christian faith, it leads us towards the recognition that there's something broken in us. When I would listen to their principal talk, I would just recognize just the little rebellion going on inside of me, and said she's right and I would be the wrong one, and she should fire me.
Right.
But all of us can experience that in different ways with pretty much any kind of rule.
Yeah, and I love that you use the family as a metaphor too, because I think that so often when it comes to rules, we think about it, like the neighborhood association model that you were giving, but instead of the family model that, hey, you're a part of the family, and because you are a part of the family, we have expectations, and you're always a part of the family, right? But there's a way that you should live that there's that we hope that you in order to stay healthy and to continue to grow and mature, there's a way that you are meant to live that enables you to flourish in that way. Yeah.
Absolutely. And the important thing to understand when it comes to how the Old Testament and New Testament fit together is that when Jesus came, he said, I did not come to abolish the law.
Right.
He says, not a jot or tittle, not one little part of the law is going to go away. But he says, I didn't come to abolish, but I came to fulfill it. And so what that means is that Jesus came as like the true Israelite. God himself came as a true Israelite, and he fully obeyed everything. He fully expressed not just what the law wrote, but what the law intended. And then for every single failure that each of us have regarding the law, he paid the punishment for that law. And so he fully fulfilled the righteous requirements of the law, but he also met the just requirements of the law, that look, there's a cost to this, there's a cost to sin, there's a cost to failure. And so Jesus, in his death on the cross, died to fulfill the law's requirements, that there needs to be judgment against sin. And so anyone who's a follower of Christ never has to stand to pay the price for their sins, because that's what Jesus has done. He's fully fulfilled that law. So any one of us, we participate in the family life of the family of God as fully righteous family members, fully loved, without any shame, without any guilt, because of our relationship with Jesus, we share in his fully met requirements of the law. And so no longer does the laws of the past hold me back. Now that it's fulfilled, I can literally live out the summaries that Jesus gave. Look, all of these things point us to love God and love each other. One way of looking at it, if you think of it this way, is you were a communications major, right? And then you went out and you kind of went into a communications job where you're kind of learning it. I was a business major, and well, I didn't use that very much.
Went to seminary.
Yeah, I went to seminary. Anyway, but like, if you're going to a school to learn a trade, you learn all sorts of methods, and you'll learn methods in the classroom. But invariably, you get out of the classroom and you work for a craftsman. And when you work for the craftsman, you begin thinking about the methods in light of the master craftsman.
Right.
So you would never go to the master craftsman and said, well, in Statistics 301, they taught me to do it this way, and this way. The master craftsman looked like, well, let me just tell you what they meant.
Yeah.
And after your apprenticeship with that master craftsman, and you're out on your own, when you're facing a challenge, you're not necessarily going back to the books to find the methods. You think about, okay, how did the master craftsman apply those methods? And then we live that out. And in some ways, when it comes to the law, we look at Jesus the very same way. Of course the law matters. Loving the Lord God with all heart, soul, and mind matters. And like when it comes to rest and not murdering and all those requirements, those really matter. But as Christians, we look at how Jesus fulfilled those and how he did them as the master craftsman of the law.
Yeah.
So
that's good. That's great. So this next question is kind of switching gears a little bit, and it's a question that maybe many people have about how do we reconcile the fierce nationalism of Old Testament Israel, so often committing God-directed genocide among neighboring heathens, with Jesus's gospel mandate to reach out into Gentile areas.
I'm glad you asked that question, Rachel. No, this
It's a question that I've been mulling over for a long time.
So in your devotions, like, does God want me to go have genocide?
This is the perfect question to ask Mark, the God Questions podcast.
This is one of those things that kind of gets blown up and made into something that's really not actually accurate. But like those who want to like create some like clickbait or create some emotional energy, they'll say certain things. There was this moment in the life of Israel where Israel came into the land of Canaan and drove out the Canaanites, and anybody who was left, there was a warfare, and Israel was to end that warfare. And that's the only place where anybody could even come within, 75 miles of suggesting any sort of Old Testament genocide.
Yeah.
But because there's a couple aspects of this that is troubling, and I get it because I've read it. I'm like, what does that mean?
Right.
I'm going to walk us through just a few things around that. All right. So, like I said, there's only one part of history where this was the case. And that being said, there's this thing where the Israelites were to put this thing under the ban. Everything left alive was to be killed. And people are like, oh my goodness, they must have killed thousands and thousands and thousands of people. And it really wasn't true. What was really going on was that as the Israelites came out, most of the people were driven out of the land of Canaan. They left the land of Canaan. And the idea was that there was an announcement of a judgment, and I'll talk about that in just a moment on those specific people. Within the land of Canaan, the question that comes out of that though is like, it kind of feels like colonialism. And there was a day where Christopher Columbus was cool, and there was a statue in Philadelphia in 1993, but now that statue's not very cool because it's like, wow, colonialism, it sounds bad, and there's so many parts of it that is bad. The Bible didn't consider this colonialism at all. There's a moment where, the land of Canaan wasn't sort of occupied. Abraham came to it and was promised to them. But there was this moment in the life of Abraham where God made this like prophecy that there's going to be a moment of judgment on the Amorites that were there, but that wasn't going to be for another 400 years, which it was written down, but like not much was made of it. We learn in retrospect here that there's something specific going on with these people that God was addressing, I'll just kind of list the specific thing that God was addressing when it comes to these specific people. They were an idolatrous people. They were incestuous. There was a temple prostitution situation. So all spirituality involved prostitution, and there was child sacrifice and bestiality and burning of their sons and daughters. And it became this sort of fermenting place when it came to sort of witchcraft and sorcery and all sorts of things. And so when you see the Israelites moving into the land of Canaan, the Bible almost makes it much more about God like protecting humanity from this evil, than it was the sort of the righteousness of the Israelites. In fact, in Deuteronomy 9:5, God says to the Israelites, it says, "It is not because of your righteousness or your integrity that you're going in to take possession of their land, but on account of the wickedness of these nations." Which actually brings up some other questions as well, if you think of it.
Right, no, it does. So like, why Israel? Like, why does God use Israel to judge other nations?
Yeah, and that, as you read that, that's sort of the question of, is there something that's that special about Israel? Well, right here we read, there isn't something that special about Israel. God, they're certainly special to God's people, and God was going to work through them. But all throughout the Old Testament, you see God using one nation to judge other nations. You see this place where God said, when the Israelites were going into Canaan, he says to Moses, "Do not harass the Moabites or provoke them to war. For I'm not going to give you any part of their land. I have given Ar to the descendants of Lot. They get to keep that land." So there were certain parts that the Israelite was not to take. Mm-hmm. But you see other places where God's going to use Babylon, or God was going to use the Assyrians. And there's this sense that God would use nations to protect the vulnerable from other. God would use horrible nations to protect people from other horrible nations. And there's this kind of consistent message, and we'll read in the Old Testament that God was using all of the nations to kind of judge the nations more carefully. And the interesting thing, the scandal of it actually, is that God doesn't actually use Israel to judge the nations really at all. Just there's that one moment when they moved into Canaan. What you see much more is that God used the nations to judge Israel. And so there's this statement, like very early on when they were planning and Moses was with them and they're understanding who they're going to be as a nation. God said to them, it says, "You must keep my decrees and my laws." And you need to recognize you can't just do what everybody else is doing in this land, because if you do these detestable things and they're done by the people that were done by the people land who lived before you, the land will become defiled, and if you defile the land, it will vomit you out as it vomited out the nations that were before you. The idea of the law is that, like, hey, look, God says, I have a vision for your life. I want you to live differently than the Amorites.
Right.
And if you start doing what they're going to do, you'll get judged by them as well.
Yeah.
And so you see the story that drives through the Old Testament. The God of Israel is nurturing his people to be their own. He brought them out of Egypt. He cleared for them the land. He taught them to worship him alone. And now he's keeping them from foreign gods. God is patient with them, but they persist. But eventually you'll see that God brings the Syrians to basically bring a judgment down on the northern tribes.
Yeah.
And then eventually Babylon comes to bring a judgment because they just kind of failed at law number one. There's only one God. But it took that judgment, it took that cleansing, it took that challenging of the people before they finally figured out, okay, there's one God.
Yeah.
But like that was the 8 to 1,000 year process of dealing with the law and living with it.
Yeah. So coming into today's context, I mean, again, just looking at the person of God, I get this statement, and I'm sure you've gotten it a lot too, of like, why, or this question of why is God so judgy? Like, he just seems like he's always judging people. He's coming up with these laws, and not really understanding the intention behind it.
Yeah, and the same thing can be said of just about any preschool parent, right? Because they're constantly correcting, challenging. Yeah. Remember, God's forming a people.
Yeah.
God's forming a people, and as the people of Israel grow, it's less laws. It's now principles. Mm-hmm. It's now challenges. The issues become more and more mature because God is trying to form a people who would understand that there was a one God, and once that one God came in the person of Jesus, they would be able to respond to him. Mm-hmm. It is troubling, though, that judgment could happen in this world through warfare. It's troubling that people could become so wicked and so evil in their geographic, and that a geographic eradication would be necessary. But the true scandal of justice is the cross of Jesus. Mm-hmm. Is that the one person who did live out the law, who lived out the vision of life, took on for himself the sin of the world. And it's this astonishing thing that's really almost hard to get our hands around. I think that deep down we want a God that would not be judgy, but everybody has to make judgments all the time.
Right.
I don't think that situation is safe. Yeah. I need to protect somebody here. I don't think I want to go out with that person. Mm-hmm. I don't think I want to handle this thing. We have to constantly make judgments. Miroslav Volf, a theologian from Eastern Europe, was once asked if the language of judgment in religion was what motivated people to wars of retribution. You'll hear the atheists say this, is that like why we have these religious wars is because of all the retributive justice in like the sacred text, which is an exaggeration. But his response was the opposite. He said this is only when people have no faith in ultimate justice that they must take up arms for their own dignity. In fact, what he would say, it is the hope of justice that opens up the possibility for forgiveness, knowing that true justice will be done someday. The only hope for a genuine reconciliation is that justice will be done at some point. And so, as we think about that, like it's we'd like to have a hippie Jesus that doesn't judge, but then what do you do about real evil? What do you do about what's wrong with this world?
Right.
At some point that needs to be said, and if there's not a God who's going to stand up for the unjust, well, let's everybody get their own tyrant, everybody get their own despot, because then it's like everybody for themselves.
Well, and wouldn't you say that we are all, I mean, just like you were saying earlier, like we are all coming in with our own judgments. We all have our own worldview that we're coming into. And so some of these really contentious social justice issues can get quite heated. But we have to remember that no matter what side of the aisle that you are on, you are coming in with your own judgments and your own worldview. So I think that relates to what you're saying when we look at who God is too.
And the beauty of it is that because a Christian doesn't stand on their own righteousness, any judgment we have is never going to be condemnation.
Yeah.
A Christian never speaks of condemnation,
Right.
Because any place that we would stand when it comes to righteousness would only come from Jesus.
Yeah.
And so anybody else who would be condemned, we can stand right alongside them. So we can never pick up a stone. Now, do we have to make decisions and do we have to think through things? Yes, but never does a Christian ever condemn.
Right.
Because for the Christian, there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus.
Yeah, as Paul says in Romans 8:1, right?
Dang.
That's awesome. Cool. Hey, well, thanks so much for joining us for another episode of the God Questions podcast. We hope to see you or talk to you if you're just listening on our next podcast. And again, if you are in the Westchester area or in the Philadelphia area, we would love to see you on a Sunday morning at Fugate Middle School. We meet right off of Paley Pike and Ellis Lane at 9 a.m. and 10:30 a.m.
And if they have questions, if they want to add to the queue, what should somebody do?
Yeah. If you have any questions, you can email info@project938.net, or you can text in your questions to a number that I don't know right now, but we will put it in our comments when we post this video. So thanks. We'll see you next time.
Have a great week.